The sun rose blood-red over the cracked mud banks of the Nile, casting long shadows across what remained of the granary walls in the village of Ankhtawi. And Amenhotep the baker pressed his calloused palm against the cool limestone of the storage chamber, feeling the emptiness within like a hollow in his own chest. For 3 seasons had passed since the great warehouses of Memphis had sent grain downriver. 3 seasons since the nomarchs had ceased their endless squabbling long enough to remember that common people required bread to survive. And in that time the village had learned to celebrate the smallest mercies with the fervor of those who knew that tomorrow might bring nothing at all. His daughter Neferet stood beside him in the gray dawn light, her thin arms wrapped around a clay jar that contained perhaps 2 handfuls of emmer wheat, salvaged from the corners of the granary where mice had not yet ventured, and she looked up at him with eyes that had seen too much hunger for her 12 years, yet still held that spark of defiant hope that made him believe they might endure another season of chaos. The first intermediate period, the scribes who still kept records called it, as if giving this time of dissolution a formal name might contain its terror, might make sense of the way the old kingdom had fragmented like sun-baked pottery, leaving each village and town to fend for itself, while petty lords warred over territories their ancestors had governed in peace under the divine order of a united pharaoh. Amenhotep had been young when the last great king died, when the copper mines of Sinai fell silent, when the trade routes to Punt withered like plants denied water. And he had watched his village transform from a prosperous way station on the river road to Memphis into a desperate community where every sunrise was a gift and every meal a cause for gratitude. The old festivals had taken on new meaning in these years of scarcity, no longer mere observances of religious calendar days, but genuine celebrations of survival, feasts cobbled together from whatever the fishermen could catch, whatever the gleaners could find in the fields, whatever the hunters could bring back from the desert margins where gazelle and ibex still occasionally wandered within range of a skilled archer's bow. Today was the feast of Renenutet, goddess of the harvest, and though there had been precious little harvest to celebrate, the village elders had declared that they would gather at sunset, that they would pool their resources and create a meal together, that they would remember what it meant to be human beings rather than mere animals scraping for existence. Neferet shifted the jar in her arms and said, "Father, will there truly be bread tonight? Real bread with honey, like you used to make when mother was alive?" And Amenhotep felt his throat tighten at the mention of his wife Mutemwiya, who had died 2 floods ago when fever swept through the village and the healing priests had no medicine to offer. Their supplies of myrrh and frankincense long since exhausted, their connection to the great temples of the south severed by banditry and warfare. He placed his hand on his daughter's head, feeling the warmth of her scalp through her dark hair, and said, "Yes, little Lotus. If the gods are kind, and if old Kenti the beekeeper still has honey in his hives, we will make bread that would have pleased your mother's spirit." And even as he spoke, he was calculating in his mind what they had to contribute to the communal feast. The precious wheat in Neferet's jar, the 3 dried fish hanging in their house that he had been saving for the lean days of low water, the handful of dates he had traded for by mending the sandals of a passing merchant who had braved the dangerous roads in hope of profit. The village of Ankhtawi numbered perhaps 200 souls now, down from the 400 who had lived here in more prosperous times, some lost to hunger and disease. Others departed to seek better fortune in the Delta or in the southern provinces, where some semblance of order still persisted under the Theban nomarchs, who claimed to rule in the name of Ma'at, the eternal principle of truth and justice that seemed to have abandoned the Black Land entirely. Yet those who remained had formed bonds stronger than blood, forged in the crucible of shared suffering. And Amenhotep knew every face in the village as he knew his own reflection in the polished bronze mirror that had been his wife's prized possession. There was Kenti the beekeeper, an ancient man whose age no one could determine with certainty, who tended his hives in the palm grove with the devotion of a priest attending a shrine, and who claimed that his bees knew the secrets of survival that humans had forgotten, that they understood how to work together without the need for kings or nobles to command them. There was Takayet the weaver, whose fingers could transform the coarsest flax into linen fine enough for a noble's kilt, though these days she wove mostly baskets and rope, for who had silver to pay for fine cloth when bread was worth more than gold? There was Hunefer the fisherman, whose nets brought in the tilapia and catfish that kept the village from starvation, who knew every eddy and sandbar of the river as intimately as a lover knows the body of the beloved, and who sang old songs in the evenings that reminded them all of times when Egypt had been great and unified and safe. There was Senwosret, who had once been a soldier in the army of the Memphis Nomarch, until that army had dissolved in a failed campaign against the Heracleopolitan forces, and who now served as the village's protector and hunter, his spear arm still strong despite the scar that ran from his shoulder to his elbow, a remembrance of a battle whose purpose he could no longer recall with any clarity. These and others made up the fabric of Anktawi's survival, each person contributing their skills and labor to the collective good, and tonight they would gather not merely to eat but to affirm their continued existence, to declare through the act of feasting that they were still human beings capable of joy and gratitude despite the chaos that swirled around them like floodwaters threatening to sweep away the last remnants of the old order. Amenhotep took the wheat jar from Neferet, and they walked together through the village's narrow lanes, past houses of mud brick that showed cracks in their walls from lack of maintenance, past the small temple of Hathor, where the resident priest Amenemhat still performed the daily rituals, though the goddess's statue had long since been stripped of its gold leaf, melted down and traded for grain during a particularly desperate season. The morning air was cool and sweet, carrying the scent of river water and papyrus, and for a moment Amenhotep could almost imagine that nothing had changed, that Egypt still stood eternal and unchanging as it had for countless generations, that somewhere in Memphis or Thebes a divine king still sat upon the throne of Horus and maintained the cosmic balance that kept chaos at bay. But then he saw the collapsed granary wall that no one had the resources to repair, saw the empty marketplace where merchants once displayed exotic goods from Nubia and the Levant, and reality reasserted itself with the weight of stone. At his house, a modest dwelling of 4 rooms arranged around a small courtyard where Mutemwaya had once grown herbs and vegetables, he found preparations already underway. For Neferet had risen before dawn to grind what little grain they had, and the quernstone showed traces of flour that she had carefully collected in a bowl, not wasting a single precious grain. He set about building a fire in the courtyard's clay oven, using dried dung for fuel. For wood was scarce and reserved for carpentry and the essential work of tool-making. And soon flames crackled beneath the oven's dome while Neferet mixed the flour with water and a pinch of salt that represented a significant portion of their wealth, for salt was another commodity that had become dear in the years of disruption. As he worked, Amenhotep's mind drifted back to the last great feast he could remember, the Jubilee celebration of old King Neferkari, who had ruled in Memphis before the dissolution began. When the granaries had overflowed, and beer had flowed like the Nile itself, when dancers and musicians had performed for 3 days and 3 nights, when even the poorest laborer had eaten meat and honey cakes until their bellies ached from fullness rather than emptiness, and he wondered what had happened to bring low such plenty. Whether it was the anger of the gods at some transgression of the kings, or simply the inevitable decay that afflicted all things in time, even kingdoms that had stood for thousands of years. The dough began to take shape under Neferet's skilled hands, for he had taught her everything Mutemwaya had known about the baker's art, and she shaped small loaves with a competence that would have made her mother proud, each one marked with a thumbprint to identify it as coming from their household. For tonight's feast would be a communal affair where everyone's contributions would be pooled and shared, and it was important to know who had brought what, not for purposes of pride or judgment, but so that the elders could ensure that each household was contributing according to its means and receiving according to its needs. While the bread baked, filling the courtyard with an aroma that made Amenhotep's stomach clench with hunger and anticipation, he retrieved the dried fish from where they hung in the storage room, their scales gleaming dully in the shaft of sunlight that penetrated through the high window, and he inspected them carefully for any sign of rot or insect damage, finding them sound, their flesh still firm beneath the salt-preserved skin, and he thought of the day Hunefer had given them to him in exchange for 2 loaves of bread. A trade that had seemed almost profligate at the time, but which now appeared as an investment in tonight's celebration, a postponement of immediate gratification in favor of a greater communal good. The morning advanced and the sun climbed higher, burning away the cool river mist, and throughout Anktawi other households were engaged in similar preparations, each family assessing what they could contribute to the evening's feast without condemning themselves to starvation in the days that would follow. A calculation that required both generosity and prudence in equal measure. For to give too little would shame one's household and weaken the bonds of community. But to give too much might mean death when the next crisis arrived, as it inevitably would in these uncertain times. Amenhotep wrapped the dried fish carefully in palm leaves, then gathered the dates he had saved, each one precious as a jewel, their wrinkled skins concealing flesh that was concentrated sweetness. The taste of better times preserved in dried fruit that had somehow survived the journey from the southern oases, where date palms still flourished under the care of farmers who had not yet abandoned their groves to the encroaching desert. Neferet removed the bread from the oven, the loaves perfectly golden, their crusts crisp and their interiors soft, and she arranged them in a woven basket with the reverence of a priestess handling sacred objects. For in truth, bread had become sacred in these lean years, more precious than any offering that might be laid upon an altar, more potent than any prayer in sustaining the fragile thread of life. They set out together toward the village square as the sun reached its zenith, joining a procession of neighbors who emerged from their houses bearing baskets and jars, bundles and bowls, each contribution modest by the standards of the Old Kingdom, but representing genuine sacrifice in the context of present scarcity, and Amenhotep felt a surge of fierce pride in his people. These stubborn survivors who refused to surrender their humanity, even as the world they had known crumbled around them like the cliffs of soft limestone that lined the river valley. In the square, the village elders had already begun organizing the contributions, sorting them by type, and arranging them on reed mats spread across the packed earth. And Amenhotep saw with wonder that despite everything, despite the chaos and the hunger and the fear, the people of Ankhtawi had managed to assemble the makings of a genuine feast. Not the lavish abundance of former times, perhaps, but something far more meaningful, a meal created through collective sacrifice and mutual support. Every element of it representing someone's choice to share rather than hoard, to trust in community rather than retreat into the isolation of individual survival. Kenti, the beekeeper, had brought 3 small jars of honey, golden and thick, glowing like captured sunlight when the light struck them at the right angle. And he explained in his quavering voice that the bees had been unusually productive this season, as if they sensed the village's need and had worked overtime to provide sweetness in a bitter age. Though Amenhotep suspected the old man had simply given more than he could afford, that he would go without honey in his own tea for many months to come so that the children of Ankhtai might taste something sweet tonight. Takayet the weaver had contributed a basket of tiger nuts, those small tubers that grew wild along the river margins and could be eaten raw or ground into flour, their taste slightly sweet and nutty. A food that had sustained the ancestors of the ancestors in times before the first dynasties, before the Great Pyramids rose from the desert, before Egypt learned to be an empire. And there was something profoundly appropriate about returning to such ancient sustenance in this time of dissolution, as if the people were reaching back across millennia to remember how their forebears had survived in harder times even than these. Hunefer the fisherman had brought not only fish, but also a net bag filled with lotus roots, dredged from the shallows where the sacred flowers bloomed, their roots starchy and filling when boiled, their blossoms beautiful enough to decorate the feast tables and remind everyone that beauty had not entirely fled from the world, that the gods still caused flowers to bloom, even if they seemed to have forgotten to maintain the kingdom that humans had built in the Black Land. Senwosret the hunter arrived last, bearing across his shoulders the carcass of a young gazelle that he had tracked into the eastern desert and brought down with a throw of his spear that had required all his skill and the blessing of the gods. For game had become scarce, as human desperation had driven hunters to pursue every living creature with relentless intensity, and the appearance of this meat, this protein that would give strength and energy to bodies weakened by too many meals of bread and fish, this flesh that could be roasted over fire and eaten with the primal satisfaction of humanity's most ancient meals, caused a murmur of excitement to ripple through the assembled villagers, and even the most stoic among them allowed smiles to crack their weathered faces. The priest Amenemhat emerged from Hathor's temple wearing his leopard skin cloak, the spots faded and the fur patchy from age and wear, but still carrying the authority of his office, still marking him as the intermediary between the human and divine realms, and he raised his hands for silence. His voice, when he spoke, carrying the trained resonance of one who had spent years learning to project ritual words across temple courtyards and sacred chambers. And he said, "People of Anktawi, children of the river, bearers of Ma'at in a time of Isfet, we gather tonight as our ancestors gathered in the first days, before the unification, before the great kings. When each community stood alone and survived through cooperation and mutual care. And though we might wish for the return of the old order, though we might pray for a mighty pharaoh to arise and restore what has been lost, we must also recognize that we are demonstrating in our own small way the principles that made Egypt great in the first place, the understanding that together we are strong, that shared burdens are lighter, that celebrated joys are sweeter, and that even in the midst of chaos and uncertainty, we remain human beings capable of gratitude, generosity, and hope." His words fell upon the assembly like rain upon parched soil, and Amenhotep felt something stirring in his chest, some emotion that transcended mere hunger or relief, something that spoke to the deeper currents of human experience, the need to belong to something larger than oneself, to participate in traditions that connected the present moment to the vast sweep of history, to believe that one's life mattered in some cosmic scheme, even if the structures that had once provided that meaning had collapsed into disorder. The afternoon was given over to preparation, with tasks divided according to skill and ability, and the village square transformed into a vast outdoor kitchen where fires were built and cooking vessels assembled, where the gazelle was butchered with ritual care by Senwasret, who knew the proper prayers to speak over an animal's death, thanking its spirit for the gift of its flesh and asking the gods to speed its journey to whatever afterlife awaited the creatures of the desert. And the meat was divided into portions that would be roasted on spits or boiled in pots, with wild onions and herbs that the village children had gathered from the riverside, their sharp young eyes spotting edible plants that adults might have missed in their focused search for more substantial fare. The women took charge of the bread making, pooling all the flour that had been contributed and working together to knead and shape loaves in quantities that seemed almost miraculous given how little each household had possessed individually. And Neferet worked alongside them, her small hands moving with practiced efficiency. And Amenhotep watched her and saw in her face a reflection of Mutemwia, the same determination, the same quiet strength, the same refusal to be diminished by circumstances beyond her control. And he felt grateful that his daughter had this community to support her, these women who had become surrogate mothers and aunts, who would ensure she learned not just the practical skills of survival, but also the deeper wisdom of how to maintain one's humanity in inhumane times. The men worked to construct tables from palm logs and planks salvaged from a collapsed warehouse, creating a long surface where the food could be displayed and around which the villagers could gather. And there was something deeply satisfying about this manual labor. This physical act of building something functional and communal, this assertion that they were not merely passive victims of historical forces, but active agents capable of shaping their immediate environment, even if they could not control the larger currents of political chaos and economic collapse that swirled beyond their village boundaries. As the sun began its descent toward the western cliffs, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that rivaled any artist's palette, the feast began to take visible form. The tables filling with dishes that represented the fruits of collective effort and shared sacrifice, baskets of bread still warm from the ovens, their crusts glistening with honey that had been brushed on in the final moments of baking, bowls of boiled lotus root mixed with tiger nuts and seasoned with the last precious stores of cumin and coriander that the village possessed, platters of roasted gazelle meat, the fat dripping and hissing as it fell into the fires, sending up smoke that carried the aroma throughout the village and drew people from their homes like a summons from the gods themselves. And there were fish prepared 3 different ways, some grilled over coals, others boiled in clay pots with leeks and garlic, still others dried and pounded into a paste that could be spread on bread or eaten with vegetables, each preparation representing culinary knowledge passed down through generations, techniques refined over centuries of Nilotic civilization, methods of turning the river's bounty into sustenance and pleasure. The children of the village, those precious inheritors of an uncertain future, ran between the tables in excitement, their laughter a sound that had become too rare in recent seasons. And the adults watched them with expressions that mingled joy and sorrow, Happiness at seeing the young ones experiencing something like a normal childhood moment, sadness at knowing how much had been lost. How much these children would never experience of the security and prosperity that previous generations had taken for granted, and yet there was also hope in those young faces. Hope that perhaps they would be the ones to see better times return, that perhaps the chaos of the first intermediate period would eventually give way to reunification and renewal. As the old stories said had happened before in Egypt's long history, for the land had endured previous times of trouble and had always eventually found its way back to order and plenty. Or so the priests and storytellers claimed, though Amenhotep sometimes wondered if those old tales were merely comforting fictions, stories people told themselves to make bearable the unbearable reality of a world that seemed to have lost its way entirely. As the sun touched the horizon, transforming the Nile into a ribbon of molten copper that flowed between its banks like the blood of Ra himself coursing through the veins of the world, the priest Amenemhat lit the sacred fire at the center of the square, using coals brought from the temple's eternal flame that had somehow been kept burning through all the years of chaos. Tended by a succession of priests who understood that some symbols mattered more than practical considerations, that the continued burning of that flame represented continuity with the past and faith in the future. A declaration that the gods had not entirely abandoned Egypt even if their favor seemed diminished in these troubled times. The villagers began to gather around the tables, arranged not according to rank or wealth, for such distinctions had become meaningless in a community where everyone struggled equally. But according to family groups and friendships, the bonds that had proven more durable than the political structures that had once organized Egyptian society into its neat hierarchies of priests and scribes, nobles and craftsmen, farmers and laborers. All those carefully maintained distinctions that had dissolved when the central authority collapsed, and each person had to rely on their own skills and the goodwill of their neighbors to survive. Amenhotep found a place at the table between Kenti the beekeeper and Hunefer the fisherman, with Nefret settling beside him, her eyes wide as she surveyed the spread of food that covered the tables. More abundance than she had seen gathered in one place in her entire remembered life. And he put his arm around her thin shoulders and felt the fragility of her bones beneath his hand. A reminder of how close they all lived to the edge of starvation, how tenuous their grip on survival remained despite tonight's apparent plenty. The priest raised his hands once more and began the traditional blessing, the words in the old language that even he probably did not fully understand. Phrases that had been passed down from a time when the gods walked more openly in the world, and their commands were clear, and their favor evident in the prosperity of the land. And though the meaning of individual words might have been lost, the cadence and rhythm of the prayer still carried power, still connected those present to the countless generations who had spoken similar words over similar meals, still affirmed that they were part of something larger and older than their individual lives, part of a civilization that had endured for thousands of years and might yet endure for thousands more if enough people held fast to the old ways and the old values. We thank Renenutet, goddess of the harvest, though the harvest is small, Amenemhat intoned, his voice carrying across the square in the gathering darkness. We thank Hapi, god of the Nile. Though the inundation is unpredictable, we thank Hathor, lady of joy and celebration, for allowing us to gather in peace and friendship. We thank all the gods and goddesses of the Black Land who watch over us still, even in this time of trials. And we ask that they continue to sustain us, to protect us, to guide us through the darkness toward a dawn of renewal and restoration, when Ma'at will once again reign supreme, and the two lands will be united under a strong and just pharaoh who rules with wisdom and compassion. A single word spoken in unison that meant simply, "It is true." And then the feast began in earnest, hands reaching for bread and meat, bowls being filled with lotus root and tiger nuts, beer being poured from large jars into smaller cups. The beer thin and sour by the standards of better times, but still intoxicating, still capable of loosening tongues and lightening spirits, still serving its ancient function of transforming ordinary consciousness into something more expansive and joyful, allowing people to forget for a few hours the weight of their daily struggles and the uncertainty of their futures. Amenhotep tore a piece of bread and dipped it in honey, then placed it in his mouth and closed his eyes, savoring the combination of textures and flavors, the crisp crust giving way to soft interior, the sweetness of the honey complementing the nutty taste of the emmer wheat, and for a moment he was transported back to his childhood, to feast days when his own father had been alive. When the family had gathered around their table in a house that seemed enormous in memory, though it had probably been quite modest, when the world had made sense and the future had seemed assured, when he had believed with the unquestioning faith of a child that Egypt would always be Egypt, eternal and unchanging, the center of the world and the favorite of the gods. He opened his eyes and looked around the square, at the faces of his neighbors illuminated by firelight, and he saw in their expressions a complex mixture of emotions, joy at the feast certainly, but also sadness for absent loved ones, those who had died in the years of chaos or departed to seek better fortune elsewhere. Those empty places at the table that reminded everyone of what had been lost even as they celebrated what remained, and he thought that this was perhaps the truest form of celebration. Not the thoughtless revelry of those who had never known hardship, but the conscious choice to affirm life and community even while acknowledging pain and loss, to feast not in denial of suffering but in defiance of it, to declare through the act of sharing food and drink that they remained human beings capable of joy despite everything the world had thrown at them. Neferet took a piece of roasted gazelle meat and bit into it, fat running down her chin, and she made a small sound of pleasure that caused several nearby adults to smile. For there was something profoundly satisfying about seeing a child enjoy food with such unself-conscious delight, something that reminded them all of what they were fighting to preserve. Not merely their own lives, but the possibility of a future in which children could grow up healthy and strong, in which the next generation might rebuild what this generation had seen destroyed, in which Egypt might once again become the great and prosperous land it had been in the golden age of the pyramid builders and the mighty warrior kings. Kenti, the beekeeper, leaned close to Amenhotep and said, his voice rough with age and emotion, "Your Mutemwia would be proud to see how well you and the girl have managed. Proud to see what a fine young woman Neferet is becoming. I remember when your wife was just such a girl herself, full of life and hope, and I see that same spirit in your daughter. That same refusal to be broken by hardship, that same determination to find sweetness even in bitter times, like my bees who continue to make honey no matter how sparse the flowers, who understand that their purpose is to create something beautiful and nourishing, even when the world seems intent on destroying everything of value." Amenhotep felt tears prick his eyes, but he blinked them away, not from any sense of masculine shame at displaying emotion. For Egyptian men had never been taught to suppress their feelings in the way he had heard foreign men were expected to do, but simply because he did not want to burden this moment of communal celebration with his personal grief, did not want to cast a shadow over what should be an evening of shared joy, though he suspected that everyone present carried similar burdens, similar losses, similar scars from the years of chaos and deprivation. Across the table, Taka-et the weaver was telling a story to a group of children who had gathered around her, a tale from the old days about how the god Osiris had taught humans to cultivate grain and make bread, how he had shown them the arts of civilization that separated people from animals, how he had been murdered by his jealous brother Set and cut into pieces and scattered across the land, but how his wife Isis had gathered the pieces and resurrected him, and how from his death and rebirth had come the promise that all things could be renewed, that even what seemed permanently destroyed might be restored if enough people worked together with love and determination. And Amenhotep listened to the familiar story and understood that Taka-et was not merely entertaining the children, but teaching them a lesson they would need in the years ahead, planting in their minds the idea that resurrection and renewal were possible, that the current chaos was not the final chapter of Egypt's story, but merely a difficult passage that would eventually lead to something better. Hunefer the fisherman had brought out a small hand drum and was tapping out a rhythm, nothing elaborate, just a simple beat that seemed to match the pulse of blood through veins, the rhythm of life itself. And soon others joined in, clapping their hands or stamping their feet, and someone began to sing one of the old river songs, a melody that fishermen had sung since time immemorial as they cast their nets into the Nile's waters, a tune that predated kingdoms and dynasties, that belonged to the land itself rather than to any particular era or ruler. And other voices joined the first until the square was filled with music, rough and untutored perhaps, but genuine and heartfelt. The sound of a community affirming its continued existence through the most ancient of human activities, the creation of music and song. Senwosret the hunter, who rarely spoke of his experiences in the wars that had ravaged the land, suddenly stood and began to tell a story. His voice carrying that particular quality of authority that came from having survived terrible things, and he spoke of a battle he had witnessed between the forces of two rival nomarchs, men who had once been brothers under the old United Kingdom, but who now fought each other with savage intensity over control of a grain depot. How he had watched hundreds of men die for a few months' worth of wheat. How he had seen the futility of such conflicts. The way they consumed everything of value while creating nothing. How he had deserted after that battle. Had walked away from the army and returned to his village because he had realized that the only meaningful resistance to chaos was not to fight others for scraps, but to build something worth preserving. To create small islands of order and humanity in the sea of disorder that had engulfed the land. And his words fell upon the assembly with the weight of hard-won wisdom. And several other men who had also served in various armies and militias nodded in recognition, understanding from their own experiences the truth of what Senwosret was saying. The feast continued as darkness deepened and stars emerged overhead, those eternal lights that the ancients believed were the souls of the blessed dead, transformed into celestial beings who looked down upon the world of the living with benevolence and guidance. And Amenhotep tilted his head back and gazed up at the vast sweep of the night sky. At the river of stars that the priest said was the celestial Nile, along which the sun god Ra sailed in his barque each night through the underworld before being reborn each dawn. And he thought about cycles and repetitions, about how the universe seemed to be built on patterns of death and rebirth, darkness and light, chaos and order, and he wondered if perhaps Egypt's current troubles were simply part of some larger cosmic cycle, a necessary period of disorder that would eventually give way to renewed order. A time of testing that would winnow away weakness and preserve only what was strong and essential. Though such philosophical speculation seemed cold comfort when one was living through the difficult times, rather than looking back on them from the safety of a restored and prosperous future. The beer began to work its magic, loosening inhibitions and warming bellies, and the conversation around the tables grew louder and more animated, people sharing stories and jokes, reminiscing about better times but also celebrating present moments, finding humor in adversity and strength in solidarity, and Amenhotep marveled at the resilience of the human spirit. Its capacity to adapt to circumstances that would seem unbearable in contemplation, but which could somehow be endured when one had no choice. Its ability to find meaning and purpose even in situations that appeared meaningless and purposeless from an outside perspective. A young woman named Anipe, daughter of one of the village farmers whose fields had largely gone fallow due to lack of seed grain and irrigation equipment, stood and began to dance. Her movements unself-conscious and joyful, swaying to the rhythm that Hunefer continued to beat out on his drum, and soon others joined her, young and old alike, moving their bodies in ways that expressed something beyond words, something primal and essential about being alive and present in one's physical form. And the dance became a kind of prayer, an offering to the gods that required no words or formal gestures, simply the honest expression of bodies moving through space in rhythm and harmony. Neferet tugged on Amenhotep's sleeve and asked if she could join the dancers, and he nodded his permission, watching as his daughter rose and moved toward the circle of swaying bodies, her thin frame moving with a grace that reminded him painfully of Mutemwaya, who had loved to dance and had often performed at festivals in the years before illness had weakened her. And he felt the familiar ache of loss, but also a new sensation, a kind of acceptance that his wife lived on through their daughter, that death was not the absolute ending it appeared to be, but rather a transformation, a passing of life and qualities and characteristics from one generation to the next, a form of immortality that was perhaps more real and meaningful than the elaborate tomb preparations and mummification rituals that only the wealthy could afford in any case. Kenti leaned close again and said, "I have been thinking, my friend, about what we might do to ensure that nights like this become more frequent rather than more rare. About how we might build on what we have created here in Anktawi to make our village more secure, more prosperous, more capable of weathering whatever storms the future might bring. And I have some ideas I would like to discuss with you and the other elders in the coming days. Ideas about cooperative farming and shared storage, about sending trading expeditions to other villages that might have surpluses of things we lack, while we have surpluses of things they need. About creating networks of mutual support that extend beyond our immediate community to encompass whole regions of the Nile Valley, building from the bottom up what the kingdom once provided from the top down. Amenhotep looked at the old beekeeper with new appreciation, recognizing that Khenti's mind remained sharp despite his age, that he possessed a strategic vision that extended beyond mere day-to-day survival to imagine a better future and consider practical steps toward achieving it, and he nodded slowly and said, "Yes. We should talk about such things, for survival alone is not enough. We must also find ways to thrive, to grow, to build something that our children and grandchildren can inherit. Something better than the chaos we have known. And if the great kings and nobles cannot or will not provide that leadership, then perhaps it must come from communities like ours, from ordinary people who understand that their fates are bound together and that cooperation serves everyone better than conflict." Sealing a pact to work together toward a better future, and Amenhotep felt a stirring of something he had not experienced in years, something that might almost be called hope. Not the naive optimism of youth that believes everything will simply work out for the best, but rather the mature hope of someone who has seen terrible things and survived them and learned that human beings possess remarkable capacities for resilience and renewal when they choose to work together rather than tear each other apart. The dancing continued, and more people joined, forming lines and circles, moving through patterns that had been traditional at Egyptian festivals since the dawn of time. Movements that connected them to their ancestors and would connect them to their descendants, creating a thread of continuity that stretched across generations, binding the dead and the living and the yet-to-be-born into a single great family that transcended the temporary disruptions of political chaos and economic collapse. And as Amenhotep watched, he understood that this was what it meant to be Egyptian, not merely to live in the Black Land, or to speak its language or to worship its gods, but to participate in these patterns of community and celebration, to maintain these traditions even when all else failed, to preserve the essence of civilization even as its external forms crumbled and fell away. A cry went up from the edge of the square and the music stopped abruptly, bodies freezing in mid-movement, and Amenhotep's hand instinctively went to the knife he kept at his belt. For interruptions to peaceful gatherings in these times often meant danger, bandits or soldiers, or some other threat. But then he saw that the commotion was caused by the arrival of strangers. A small group of travelers who had apparently followed the light and sound of the celebration to the village, and Senwosret moved quickly to intercept them, his spear in hand, his soldier's instincts still sharp despite his years of peaceful living. The strangers numbered 5, 3 men and 2 women, all showing signs of hard travel, their clothes dusty and worn, their faces gaunt with hunger, and the eldest among them, a man whose beard was streaked with gray, raised his hands in a gesture of peace and called out, "We mean no harm, people of this village. We are travelers from the south, from Thebes, where the nomarch Intef has declared himself king and is attempting to reunify the southern provinces under his rule. We carry messages to the northern settlements, trying to establish contact and communication between communities that have been isolated from each other for too long, trying to build the networks of trade and mutual support that might eventually lead to the restoration of a united Egypt under a legitimate pharaoh who rules with justice and wisdom." Amenemhat, the priest, stepped forward, his leopard skin cloak giving him the authority to speak for the village, and he said, "Travelers are always welcome in Anktawi, for we remember the ancient laws of hospitality that our ancestors maintained even in the hardest times, and we will not turn away those who come in peace. But tell us more of this Intef of Thebes. For we have heard many men claim the title of king in recent years, and none of them have proven capable of restoring order or providing the leadership that Egypt requires." The gray-bearded stranger, who introduced himself as Seneb, a scribe in the service of Intef, spoke with the practiced eloquence of one trained in the art of persuasion, telling of how the Theban nomarch had not merely claimed kingship, but had actually begun to exercise it, establishing granaries and organizing fair distribution of grain, creating a functioning administration that collected taxes but also provided services, building an army not for conquest, but for defense of the southern territories against bandits and raiders, encouraging trade and craftsmanship, restoring temples and supporting priests, doing all the things that a proper pharaoh should do. And while Seneb acknowledged that Thebes controlled only the southern portion of Egypt, from Elephantine to Abydos, he argued passionately that this represented a beginning, a demonstration that the old order could be restored if enough people were willing to work toward that goal, to set aside their immediate self-interest in favor of a larger vision of Egyptian unity and prosperity. The villagers of Ankhtawi listened with a mixture of skepticism and hope, for they had heard such promises before from various would-be rulers who had ultimately proven to be little better than the warlords and bandit chiefs who plagued the land. But there was something different about Seneb's account, a specificity and detail that suggested genuine administrative accomplishment rather than mere grandiose claims, and Amenhotep found himself wanting to believe. Wanting to think that somewhere in Egypt there existed a leader who truly understood what was needed and possessed the ability to provide it. Amenem had invited the travelers to join the feast, for there was still food on the tables and beer in the jars, and the ancient laws of hospitality demanded that strangers be fed and sheltered regardless of other considerations. And as Seneb and his companions settled at the tables and began to eat with the restrained desperation of people who had gone too long between meals, the villagers gathered around them asking questions, seeking more information about conditions in the south, about Intef's rule, about whether there might truly be hope for eventual reunification and restoration of the old order. Seneb spoke between mouthfuls of bread and meat, describing a Thebes that was still far from the glory of Memphis in its prime, but which functioned as a real city rather than the abandoned ruin that so many settlements had become. With markets operating regularly, and craftsmen producing goods, and scribes keeping records, and priests performing proper rituals in temples that had been cleaned and repaired. With laws being enforced fairly rather than arbitrarily, with disputes being settled through judicial proceedings rather than through violence. With a sense that the future might be better than the present rather than worse, and his words painted a picture of a society that was slowly climbing out of chaos toward something resembling civilized order. One of the women travelers, a physician named Nefertari, who carried a bag of medical supplies that marked her as one of the educated elite who had received training in the healing temples, spoke of how Intef had established a system of traveling healers who visited communities throughout the southern territories bringing medicine and knowledge, treating the sick and injured without demanding payment beyond what people could afford, and she offered to examine anyone in the village who needed medical attention. An offer that was quickly accepted by several villagers who suffered from chronic ailments that had gone untreated for years due to the absence of trained physicians. Amenhotep felt a strange sensation in his chest, something that took him a moment to identify as excitement, the feeling that perhaps the long dark night of Egypt's dissolution might finally be approaching its end. That dawn might actually come rather than merely being a comforting fiction that people told themselves to make the darkness bearable. And he looked around at his neighbors and saw similar expressions on their faces. A cautious but genuine hope that maybe, just maybe, things could get better, that the chaos of the first intermediate period might give way to reunification and renewal, that their children might grow up in a world more like the Egypt of their grandparents' stories than the violent, uncertain present they currently inhabited.